Imagine just watching the S&P 500 drop like 1.6%.
Oy.
Dow futures just plummeting 670 points. And global crude oil instantly spikes to over $105 a barrel. And all of this happens, within minutes of a national presidential address.
It's just wild. Usually when a commander-in-chief, steps up to the podium during a massive crisis, the market breathes this huge sigh of relief.
Right, because you expect a roadmap.
Exactly. You expect a leader to point to a map, lay out the strategic steps, and tell the country exactly how we navigate out of the chaos.
But today, we're looking at the exact moment the market just, stopped listening to the rhetoric and started looking at the physical plumbing of the global economy. Welcome to your custom-tailored deep dive. We're unpacking this highly debated piece of political and economic commentary titled Epic Fury, the Economic and Diplomatic Toll of Trump's War.
It really is a profound case study in what happens when, domestic political messaging collides with the unforgiving realities of global logistics.
Before we go any further, though, we really need to set the parameters for this conversation.
Yeah, that's crucial.
Because the source material we've been asked to analyze today is, it's highly politically charged. It is explicitly critical of Donald Trump and the launch of Operation Epic Fury.
Right.
So, because we are dealing with active, polarizing geopolitical commentary, we just have to make it absolutely clear. We are simply the messengers here.
100%.
We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the original author, and we aren't condemning them either. Our sole objective today is to impartially report, synthesize, and break down the specific arguments, the data, and the market mechanics presented in this text so you, the listener, can be fully informed.
Right. Our focus is purely on the mechanics here.
Yeah.
Like, how does the argument actually function? And what data is the author using to support the claim that this specific speech triggered such a massive negative reaction across international markets?
Okay, let's unpack this. The author's main thesis is that this highly anticipated primetime speech left everyone, analysts, institutional investors, everyday citizens, with the exact same question they had before the cameras even rolled.
Which was, what is the actual plan?
Right. What is the plan? So let's look at the rhetoric of the speech itself and how it immediately translated into, tangible real-world consequences.
Yeah, the source breaks the administration's address down into 4 main points, which the author argues are just inherently contradictory.
So point 1, the war is absolutely necessary.
Right.
Point 2, we have already won.
Okay.
Point 3, the military action must continue. And point 4, it will all be over soon.
I mean, that combination of statements just creates an impossible puzzle for anyone trying to model the future.
Yeah, it really does.
The source actually brings in conflict resolution experts from George Washington University and the Quincy Institute to analyze that specific messaging.
And what did they find?
Well, their conclusion was that the address was functionally a repetition of everything said over the past 30 days. Like, from a strategic standpoint, there was this glaring lack of an exit strategy, no concrete timeline for withdrawal, and just zero actionable answers regarding the ongoing closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Which totally explains the brutal market reaction.
Exactly.
The text notes that earlier in the week, the market had actually rallied. Institutional algorithms and traders had, priced in a high probability that a primetime national address would feature a concrete announcement.
Like a ceasefire or something.
Yeah, a ceasefire, or maybe a negotiated reopening of the shipping lanes. Instead, they got a 15-minute speech with no structural changes. It really reminds me of a corporate crisis.
Oh, how so?
Well, imagine you're a major shareholder in a publicly traded company, right? The company is hemorrhaging cash, the main manufacturing plants have been offline for a month, and the stock is just sliding.
Sounds like a nightmare.
It is. So the CEO calls an emergency all-hands shareholder meeting. You log in, expecting this detailed, multi-step turnaround plan.
Right.
But instead, the CEO gets on camera for 15 minutes, gives a vague pep talk saying, the restructuring is necessary. We're actually already doing great, but the restructuring must continue and it'll all be fine soon, and then just logs off.
Yeah, any institutional shareholder would immediately hit the sell button after that.
Exactly.
Because markets, they have this incredible capacity to price in bad news. If a government clearly states, we are entering a grueling 6-month war of attrition, the global market will react, adjust asset allocations, absorb the initial shock, and then stabilize at a new baseline.
They just need to know what they're dealing with.
Right. What capital markets fundamentally cannot price in is pure uncertainty. So when the market realized the address lacked an exit strategy, it interpreted that silence as an implicit guarantee of long-term escalation.
I'm stuck on one thing here, though, looking at the administration's specific claims.
What's that?
If the administration goes on national television and explicitly says, quote, "We've already won," why doesn't Wall Street believe them? I mean, if the most powerful military in the world declares victory, why the immediate tank in the S&P?
Because institutional investors aren't trading on presidential rhetoric, They're trading on satellite imagery.
Yeah.
And the satellite imagery of the Persian Gulf right now shows a severely broken supply chain. You can declare a political victory all day long, but if the physical plumbing of the global economy is visibly clogged, the market is going to price in the clog.
Well, yeah.
The rhetoric simply didn't match the physical reality on the ground, which is what the author identifies as the root cause of the current economic pain.
And that physical reality is the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
The numbers the source provides here are just staggering. We are talking about a single, narrow waterway that handles roughly 20% of the world's total oil supply.
20%, just huge.
And according to the text, it has been effectively shut down for over a month. There are nearly 2,000 vessels like massive crude oil tankers, liquid natural gas carriers, standard cargo ships, just trapped inside the Persian Gulf.
It's literally a massive maritime parking lot.
It really is. And the author draws a direct causal line from those trapped ships to the reality of, the listener paying well over $4 a gallon at the gas station this week.
Yeah, it represents an absolute bottleneck in global energy logistics. What's fascinating here is how quickly localized military actions ripple out into global economic consequences.
But looking at the scale of the global economy, is it really just about this one waterway?
What do you mean?
Well, we live in an era of incredibly advanced dynamic logistics, right? If 1/5 of the global oil supply is trapped behind a blockade, wouldn't the global supply chain just, immediately reroute?
You would think so.
Or wouldn't nations just tap into their strategic petroleum reserves to flood the market and stabilize the price for the consumer?
It's a logical assumption, definitely, but it fundamentally misinterprets how physical commodities move.
Okay, how so?
People often conceptualize the global supply chain like the internet. If a massive fiber optic cable gets severed, the data packets instantly find another route through different servers with only milliseconds of lag.
Right. The system just heals itself.
Exactly. But physical oil logistics possess massive mathematical inelasticity. You cannot just lay a new thousands of miles long pipeline over land to bypass the Strait of Hormuz overnight.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And you definitely cannot reroute a supertanker across dry land. Furthermore, the strategic petroleum reserves held by the U.S. and European nations are designed to be short-term shock absorbers for, localized disruptions.
It's like a hurricane or something.
Right, like a hurricane shutting down refineries in the Gulf of Mexico for a few days. They are mathematically incapable of permanently replacing 20 million barrels of daily global supply.
And the compounding costs of that delay are astronomical.
Mm-hmm.
Every single day, those 2,000 ships sit idle. The companies that own them are paying massive compounding costs for delayed shipments, expiring delivery contracts, and
skyrocketing maritime insurance premiums for operating in a designated war zone.
Exactly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is why the diplomatic friction highlighted in the source is so critical. The author details the exchange between the U.S. administration and European allies regarding this specific oil crisis.
It's pretty blunt, right?
Very. Trump's response to European allies facing massive energy shortages was essentially, "Not my problem, go figure it out yourselves."
Oh.
And French President Emmanuel Macron publicly responded by calling that American stance unrealistic.
Which speaks directly to how oil is priced. It's a shared economic pool.
That is exactly the issue. You cannot artificially divorce American economic stability from European energy markets. Crude oil is a globally priced commodity.
So even if we have our own oil,
even if the United States produces enough domestic oil for its own use, if Europe is suddenly cut off from Middle Eastern crude, European nations have to scramble and outbid everyone else on the open market to secure alternative energy sources.
Oh, and that drives everything up.
Right. That massive surge in European demand drives up the global per barrel price, which instantly drives up the price at American gas stations.
So we pay for it anyway.
Exactly. Telling allies to figure it out themselves ignores the fundamental reality that an economic shock to Europe is an economic shock to the United States.
But that shared economic pool is exactly what makes unilateral action so dangerous, isn't it? Because if the U.S. acts without warning, Allies who are facing the brunt of this $105 a barrel fallout have zero incentive to help manage the crisis.
Precisely.
And the source details how we are seeing that fracture happen in real time. The diplomatic dominoes are falling at a speed that is, frankly, almost unprecedented in modern geopolitics.
Yeah, the author catalogs a sequence of military and logistical rejections from nations that have been locked-in partners with the United States for nearly a century.
It is a stunning list. Spain has officially closed its military bases to American operations directed at Iran.
Which is huge.
France completely shut down its airspace for supply jets heading to Israel. Italy denied permission for U.S. bombers to refuel at the Sigonella base. And Germany flat out declared to the international press, this is not our war.
To fully grasp the severity of that list,
Yeah.
you really have to look at the operational mechanics of American power projection. Take Italy's denial of the Sigonella base.
Okay, tell me about Sigonella.
In military logistics, Sigonella is known as the hub of the Med. It is the central nervous system for U.S. operations in the Mediterranean and the Middle East.
Wow. Okay.
So if a massive B-52 bomber or a heavy cargo plane cannot refuel in Italy, they can't just casually fly a little further. They have to launch from the UK or the continental US, which requires incredibly complex, expensive mid-air refueling operations.
Which I'm guessing is not ideal.
Far from it. It drastically reduces payload capacity, limits the time they can actually spend in the operational theater, and it slows down the entire supply chain.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The same thing applies to France closing its airspace. Because if you can't fly through French airspace, you have to reroute heavy transport planes out over the Atlantic, down around the Iberian Peninsula, and through the Strait of Gibraltar. And that's assuming Spain even allows that, which the text notes they're heavily restricting.
Right. It just creates these massive detours.
Like a massive global electrical grid. The United States is trying to surge military power into the Middle East. But bases like Sigonella and the Spanish naval ports, they are massive substations.
That's a great way to put it.
And suddenly 3 of your main substations intentionally flip their breakers. The power doesn't just reroute smoothly. The remaining lines overheat. The system essentially browns out.
And the core catalyst for those substations flipping their breakers is unilateralism.
Yeah.
The source is very clear on why this fracture occurred. Operation Epic Fury was launched without consulting a single ally. There was no advance warning, no joint intelligence briefings, and zero coalition building prior to the initial strikes.
None of it. It's like a lead climber on a mountain just deciding to unclip from the safety rope to go faster, only to realize later they need the team to help them down.
Exactly. The author argues that European nations aren't abandoning the United States out of a lack of resolve. They are withdrawing cooperation because their own domestic economies are bleeding due to the energy shock. And crucially, their own democratic parliaments never approved the action.
Right. You cannot expect sovereign democratic nations to absorb massive, destabilizing economic damage for a conflict they had absolutely zero say in launching.
Especially when the leaders of those nations have to answer to their own voters. I mean, if you're a parliament member in Germany or Spain and your constituents are facing crippling heating bills and inflation directly tied to a unilateral American military action.
You're going to be furious.
Oh, absolutely. Your political survival depends on distancing yourself from that action.
Which creates bizarre political realities back home in the U.S. The source specifically points out the surreal nature of the current political discourse. It notes that it's 2026, and Senator Marco Rubio is having to go on Sunday morning television to defend the basic relevance and existence of NATO.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
We are talking about an alliance that held the line during the nuclear standoff of the Cold War and invoked Article 5 immediately after September 11th.
But the domestic economic pain, the $4 a gallon at the pump, the inflation, it's being weaponized domestically to turn voters against foreign alliances.
Because people just see the price tag.
Right. When Americans feel economic pain, isolationist sentiment naturally grows. Politicians are suddenly forced to justify why the U.S. is part of an alliance structure that currently seems to be actively obstructing U.S. military logistics.
Even though the obstruction is our own fault.
Exactly. It completely ignores the fact that the obstruction is a direct result of bypassing the alliance's foundational rule of mutual consultation in the first place.
And when you bypass the alliance, you lose the collective strategic brain trust, which leads directly to the strategy deficit the author outlines in the next section.
Yeah, that deficit is glaring.
Because without allies to validate the mission and share the burden, domestic pressure on the administration intensifies. When journalists, analysts, and voters start asking, why exactly are we doing this? The rationale begins to buckle.
Right.
The source actually points out that the administration has offered 6 different, often competing explanations for why Operation Epic Fury was launched in the first place.
6. The text highlights justifications ranging from preventing a nuclear weapon to outright regime change, to protecting Israel, to securing global oil resources, to degrading terror proxy networks and establishing general deterrence.
But from a purely mechanical standpoint, those are completely different wars.
Completely different.
A naval escort mission to secure oil tankers in a strait requires a massive surface fleet and minesweepers. A campaign for forced regime change requires a million-man ground invasion and decades of occupation. And targeted strikes on nuclear facilities require specialized bunker-busting munitions and stealth aircraft. The author points out that Donald Trump claimed he did, quote, what no other president was willing to do. But the immediate question from the military establishment is, willing to do what exactly?
Right. When the stated justification for a massive military mobilization changes week to week, military planners cannot appropriately size or equip the force. The author argues this is the clearest evidence of improvisation rather than deliberate strategy.
So what does this all mean?
This raises an important question. How can you formulate an effective endgame when the goalposts are in a state of constant motion?
The most glaring evidence of this strategy deficit is the massive disconnect regarding the timeline of the conflict. The text highlights a stark, honestly incredibly dangerous contrast.
Yeah, the timeline disconnect is huge.
On one side, Trump is publicly claiming the military action will take 2 to 3 more weeks to conclude, but on the other side, Iran's foreign minister is on the record stating they are fully prepared for a grinding 6-month conflict of asymmetric attrition.
And in asymmetric warfare, the smaller power doesn't need to defeat the superpower in a pitched battle.
They just need to survive.
Exactly. They simply need to endure and ensure the economic cost for the superpower becomes politically unsustainable. If one side is planning for a 3-week decisive victory and the other side is planning to bleed the global economy for 6 months, the side with the longer timeline usually dictates the pace.
And the heavy price for that ambiguity, as the author notes, isn't just some abstract debate for political science classes. It is being paid in real time by American soldiers deploying into a region without clear objectives.
Yeah.
By American taxpayers funding a multi-billion-dollar operation with no end date, and by the nation's global diplomatic credibility, which is perhaps the single most difficult asset to rebuild once it has been fractured.
Which circles us right back to the market panic we started with.
Right.
When institutional investors look at a shifting rationale, a complete lack of allied logistical support, and an adversary actively preparing for a long, drawn-out war, they don't price in a 3-week victory. They price in a 6-month disruption of the global supply chain.
Bringing all these elements together, the author leaves us with 3 critical watch points for the immediate future. 3 looming scenarios we need to pay close attention to in the coming weeks.
Okay, let's hear them.
First, will there be a massive escalation into a ground invasion? That would mean moving from localized airstrikes to a generational commitment of troops.
Which nobody wants.
Right. Second, will a backdoor deal be quietly brokered? Often in these scenarios, third-party nations like Oman or Qatar mediate behind closed doors to allow both sides to de-escalate while publicly claiming victory to their respective bases.
And the third scenario, which the author suggests might be the most complex and historically damaging, will the United States simply declare total victory, pack up the deployed assets, and leave, even if the physical reality remains unchanged?
Just walk away.
Yeah. Will they walk away while the Strait of Hormuz remains heavily restricted and the adversary government is still firmly in power?
Any of those 3 outcomes fundamentally alters the geopolitical landscape. And the author's final plea is a reminder that you, the listener, cannot mentally categorize this as just a distant foreign policy story happening thousands of miles away.
It's happening right here.
It is directly tied to the financial infrastructure of your daily life. It dictates the volatility of your gas prices. It directly impacts the quarterly earnings in your 401k. And it is actively writing the blueprint for how the rest of the world will interact with American power for the next several decades.
Synthesizing all the data and diplomatic friction presented in this source, it really raises a fascinating, almost existential question about the nature of modern conflict. It forces us to ask, in a highly interconnected 21st century globalized economy, does the traditional mid-20th century concept of a military victory even exist anymore?
You mean the idea of, like, planting a flag and definitively winning the war?
Exactly. If achieving a theoretical victory on the battlefield requires actions that fundamentally cripple your own citizens' purchasing power, send the global energy market into a tailspin, and completely isolate your military from every major historic ally you rely on for global logistics, is that actually a victory?
That's a profound point.
The commentary strongly implies that in the modern era, deep economic resilience and the maintenance of complex cooperative alliance structures are now vastly more critical to actual national security than sheer unilateral military dominance.
It really shifts the entire paradigm. I mean, we started this conversation talking about the expectation of a clean clinical diagnosis of a crisis during a national address.
Yeah.
We crave the ability to point at a map, execute a decisive plan, declare victory, and go back to normal.
Yeah.
But in a fully globalized world where supply chains and economies are intrinsically linked, that clean break might be an illusion.
It might be impossible now.
Yeah, a military solution that fundamentally breaks the economic plumbing of the world might not actually be a solution at all. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the underlying mechanics driving the world around you, and we will catch you next time.